Hi, my name is Rasmus Karlsson and I am an associate professor in political science at Umeå University in Sweden. I have long been thinking about making a video about one of my articles, which is the most cited article that I have written. This article is called Ambivalence, Irony and Democracy in the Anthropocene, and I wrote it back in 2012 when I was living in Korea. I was living in Seoul at the time, and it's a very big city of 20 plus million people. And when I was living there, I had this sense that many things that I used to believe in, growing up in Sweden, a family without a car and having very traditional environmental values, those things, they don't really seem to work at a global scale. And many things we're now also seeing problems with, for instance, intermittent renewable energy in Sweden, the limitations of this on a European scale. But especially when you look out to the world at large, you realize that we are close to 8 billion people, and we all aspire to live a modern life. And that makes it very, very difficult when you take these trends and you look into the future to see how we can avoid a deepening crisis of unsustainability. And the most acute case, or the most acute aspect of this, is probably climate change, because it will have far-reaching consequences deep into the future. And in light of this, I felt the need to sort of conceptualize how we can think about sustainability. And I came up with this model, which I have behind me here, where I would say that there are basically, in analytical terms, there are basically two ways to resolve this crisis of unsustainability. One is to develop technology that will allow humanity to transcend its planetary boundaries, which is the A path here. The other version, or the other path you can imagine of the future, is one that seeks to impose or sort of politically enforce these limits through different political and social means. And that is the B future. And often I think we are trapped in the way we talk about a future in a way that it's just a matter of degree how much B that we are willing to sacrifice, how much we are willing to give up to preserve nature. And I think that framing is very, very problematic. And the reason I think so is because the scope, how deep these reductions would have to be in order to actually deliver global sustainability in a world of 8 billion people, that is very significant. And that, I think, is often lost in the conversation, because we look to our own countries or to our own lifestyles and we don't really extrapolate into what does this mean at a global scale. So in this article, I argue that many people, and I met many of them at conferences all over the world, and so they talk a lot about the need to cut back and to learn how to live within limits, etc., etc. But when it comes to the everyday, they still want to go to conferences, they still want to have a craft beer or have their kids go to good schools or travel the world or see many things. So I think there's a lot of hypocrisy here, a lot of double talk. In one way, we say that we are ready for sacrifice, but on a personal level, we are really not, especially not when you think of how brutal that historic reset would have to be. Because I think the key issue here is population. We are, as I said, close to 8 billion, and to properly live like we do in Sweden today, we could be probably a couple of 100 million people on the whole planet. And to go from 8 billion to a couple of 100 million people, that is a very, very difficult and probably not desirable process in terms of sociology. And when it comes to consumption, I think that it's very easy to point to these very visible things like airplanes or everyday, very sort of symbolic things. But when you take a step back and you look at the embedded energy that is everywhere in society, that we need to have home, housing, when you think about transportation, when you start to peel off this layer on the onion, it really becomes much more difficult to see how can we achieve sustainability through this B path, for what is known as degrowth. Because I would argue that if it was only a matter of, let's say, cut back 10, 20, 30% of economic activity, or maybe say ban on all commercial aviation or like leisure travel by air or something, then I think that could be an acceptable price. Even though it might be very difficult politically to do these things, I think it could still be an acceptable political price to avoid an ecological catastrophe, especially if you look deep into the future and what would come after and how many more people could live and enjoy a good life in the future. However, that is not the case. We're talking about a much, much more radical reset, one that I would say will make Pol Pot blush quite a bit when you really crunch these numbers, and especially when it comes to restrictions on reproductive choices and who are going to make these decisions. And we see already today when we have very minor tweaks like gasoline prices or protests coming for very, very, in this bigger picture, very small things. So I would argue that there is a fundamental problem of political plausibility or lack of political plausibility when it comes to this degrowth path. However, when we look up here to the A path, which is basically what many people, if you go back to the 50s or way before that, would imagine the future to be. I mean, how often have you not heard that infinite growth is not possible on a final planet? But why do we just have a planet? We have a whole universe. It's like an open sea. We're at shore. We can just go out and explore, and there are so many possibilities, especially when it comes to the longer future. And when we think about not only securing our own existence, but securing the existence of life in general and bringing life into the future seems like a very important ethical mission to secure our future in a way that we are not only trapped on this tiny little rock with all this vulnerability, but they have these great vistas of the future. The problem with the A track is that it lacks also political plausibility. I would argue most people, if you say that we can build the kind of Star Trek future, they are probably just saying, oh sure, Rasmus, and take another cafe latte. They are not committed to that kind of future. And when it comes to energy, for instance, this is very clear. Even if there are studies that show that if the rest of the world would build nuclear energy in the way Sweden did in the 1780s, we could quickly displace global fossil fuels I would say within a couple of decades, if you have more conservative estimates. But no one is talking about building thousands of new nuclear reactors. We treat our nuclear reactors as special pieces of art that you build one and then you stop, rather than using dynamics of scale and these to really sort of once and for all quit fossil energy. So I would argue when it comes to an advanced technological path to sustainability, many people, at least when you talk to them, they might on some level say that it is desirable, but they're not committed to it, even those who are, as I said, in the fold of being techno-optimists. Other people, on the other hand, when you talk about space colonization, I often heard the argument that if we don't learn how to live within limits now, what is the whole point? Because then we will never learn. And I would argue, yes, exactly, that is the point. But we don't have to change everyone. Because what I find so disturbing with the B future, which is very popular for Greta and others, is that it's about changing other people. And when we look historically, for instance, the religious wars in the 1600s, this does not seem to be such a good idea. Rather, it seems important that we have a society where people can live different lives. Some can be stockbrokers, others can be punk rockers, and we don't all have to conform to this singular ethic of sustainability. And I find this grand project of turning all humanity into a specific template of how a good person should be, I find that very disturbing from a political point of view. So I would say that it's not so easy to say that everyone is on the boat for A either or for B. So where are we? We're probably in the middle. And I think that is what I want to capture with this title, Ambivalence, Irony and Democracy in the Anthropocene. But we are ambivalent. On one hand, we might see that, okay, it's not going well, the crisis is getting worse and worse, and we might even need solar engineering in the future to protect us from the worst climate harms. So there is this picture of looming crisis, and we see with melting polar caps and worsening extreme weather events, etc., the signs are getting louder and louder. But we do not really, that doesn't necessarily translate into political action in either direction. So I also find that we are frightened by the future, or all these, Terminator or these kind of horror vision, Battlestar Galactica or whatnot, about how technology can become a threat towards us, or because we develop sentient technologies that will hurt us in the future. At the same time as I have those feelings, when it comes to cures, and I think to illness, I think specifically with COVID was a good example, but if you think broader also about cancer treatments, etc., we are very, very eager to have those treatments and to push technology forward. And so there is still, even though we are very disillusioned at one level about the possibilities of socially directed scientific progress today, which is strange considering how much our world changed in a couple of 100 years, still, I think there is a sense that we should pursue a more advanced technological future. And that brings to one last point to this, and that is the coordination problem. Because often in green political thinking, which is the discipline I've been working with, there's this assumption that if you just come up with this great idea about the future, people will come along. But that is absolutely not true, and we know this. And we know, especially when in terms of value polarization in the United States, for instance, which is very, very rampant, that the idea of pushing through this kind of Greta-esque future where everyone is supposed to live this very limited material life and refrain from having kids and refrain from going from vacation, refrain from having a car, doing all these restrictions and try to find some inner value, that is going to create an enormous value clash. So I find it very hard to imagine how this is going to be orchestrated and how we're going to put everyone on the same page so fast that it will actually deliver sustainability and not just ecological mayhem. Again, the problem is the same for the opposite track, that I find it difficult. How are we going to mobilize people, or how are we going to make them see that, okay, if you don't want to do that greater future, you have to commit to another future that depends on technological innovation and deployment of technologies such as nuclear to quickly move away from fossil energy. Thank you so much for your attention, and this paper is available online. You can find it through academia, for instance. There is the accepted manuscript. It's also available for behind a paywall, unfortunately, at Elsevier for the journal Futures. It was published in 2013, and the link is in the description below. Thank you so much.